Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today I've got yet another SMSL review. If you're like me, you're probably getting pretty fatigued of all the different SMSL and topping products coming out, and I have to admit that I was a little bit reluctant when I was approached by Aoshida Audio to review the SMSL DO100 and HO100. But they've supported the channel well in the past by sharing different products for me to review for you, and so I did say yes, and I'm kind of glad that I did. The SMSL DO100 and HO100 aren't going to change the world of audio, but I do think they're a solid option that's definitely worth knowing about. The DO100 DAC retails for $239 and the HO100 amp retails for $149, meaning that you can buy the whole package altogether for $390. The reason I think that's somewhat relevant is because that's about the same price that you pay for a Topping DX5 all-in-one. Now admittedly, the Topping DX5 is an all-in-one, that's got its own benefits, but I was curious to see if an identically priced stack or near enough to identical, if that could outperform what I've recently reviewed and said was a very, very good all-in-one. So let's dive in and find out. Starting off with the DO100 here, as you can see it's compact, it's a very simple design as well. I'll go through the actual physical designs in a moment, but what this gives you on paper is a pair of ES9038Q2M chips doing the decoding duties. It'll accept DSD and high sample rates on all the wired inputs, so not the Bluetooth of course. While we're talking Bluetooth, it's got all the latest codecs available. It's also got 7 different filter modes and also preamp capability. So it's really a pretty fully featured DAC despite being nice and small. I couldn't see any reference anywhere that it will handle MQA, so there's that if that matters to you, but I can't think of any other features that it doesn't offer that are normally available around that price point. The HO100 headphone amp that it's sitting on top of here is equally well featured on paper. It'll output 1.5 watts into 32 ohms, which means it's got enough juice to drive anything at all the way up to a Susvara. I'm not recommending it for Susvaras from a quality point of view, but it's got the juice. It also has 3 gain modes, low, medium and high, and it's got a 6.3 and a 4.4mm output for convenience. Now I say for convenience because as far as I can tell it's not a balanced amplifier, it's much like the Topping DX5 in that regard, where it's a single-ended amplifier that happens to have a balanced connector for your convenience. That said, it does take a balanced input on the back, so if you're running a balanced DAC like the DO100, you do get the benefit of balanced connections from your DAC to your headphone amp. To be clear, there's no benefit in having a balanced input on the back and a balanced output on the front. They're completely different ways of working. The one on the back is all about cancelling out any kind of environmental noise. The one on the front is about how it drives your headphone. And so on paper, we've got 2 really solid looking devices. There's nothing about them that's going to set the world on fire, but at the same time, they read like a solid device. Before I tell you how they sound though, let me give you a really quick tour of each device. And we'll start with the DAC. The DAC is super simple. We've got a clean white display over on the side of the DAC, and then we've got a control knob on the front, which is both a rotation knob and a press button, and that's going to give you access to things like the menus, the volume control, the power button, all of that sort of stuff. There is also a remote control used if you're going to be sitting away from this, but I like the fact that you can do everything you need to through the control knob. Moving around to the back, it's pretty basic, it's what you'd expect. We've got a pair of balanced outputs, we've got a pair of single-ended outputs, and then we've got our digital inputs. Specifically, we've got optical, coaxial, and a USB-C port for USB, and then of course there's an antenna for Bluetooth that I mentioned before. The DO100 also takes a full-sized AEC plug, and I do like to see that on hi-fi gear because it means you're getting a proper earth connection, which in my experience can often help remove or prevent ground loops in your system. Some of the switch mode devices I've tried can sometimes have issues with that, not always, and it's not something you should avoid switch mode power supply devices because of it, but I do like to see a full-size IAC connector where it's available. Looking now at the HO100, and we've got still a relatively simple front panel. We've got an on-off switch, an input selector switch, so RCA or XLR input, and then we've got the gain switch, as I said before, low, medium and high. followed by a volume control. Now you might already have guessed the fact that this is just an on-off switch at the front. There's no preamp capabilities on the HO100. And if we turn it around and look at the back, you'll see that it's very, very basic. We've got XLRs in and RCAs in, and that's it. Once again, another IEC connector for power, which is great. And so it's a simple, solid headphone amplifier. No extra bells and whistles, but for $149 you wouldn't really expect a lot more. And so what we should talk about now, of course, though, is how this sounds as a stack. If you're going to go out there and spend $390 how's it going to perform for you? And the answer is, it's going to sound great. It's a really excellent sounding budget stack. I've heard quite a few over the recent years, and this is one of the first ones that I've really been quite impressed with. I'm going to talk a bit later about the Topping E50 DAC, which is still one of my favourite DACs around, and a similar kind of device to this. But I think I like the DO100 and HO100 combo better than that E50 and L50 stack, and that's largely because of the L50 holding it back a bit in my opinion. Whereas when I plug this in and listen to it just in isolation, nothing else I was comparing it to, I was thoroughly enjoying everything I heard. The sound from the 100 stack is very clean and very musical, and I was particularly impressed with the sense of space it created. It doesn't just stretch everything left and right, it gave me more of a sense of the middle ground, and maybe even just a little bit of depth in the sound too, which is not normally a strong point of these Delta Sigma type DACs. Another thing that's good to know and supports the idea that this isn't a fully balanced headphone amp is that whether I use the 4.4mm out or the 6.3mm out, both outputs sounded basically the same. There could always be slight variations caused by things like connector types and even the fly leads if you're using adapters, but it's so close as to be irrelevant, and I certainly wouldn't have any issues using the 6.3 or the 4.4mm and knowing that you're getting the absolute best from the HO100. Another thing I tried as part of my testing for this review was to connect each of these individually as components up to much higher end devices. So I tried the DO100 driving the Burst & Soloist GT amp, and I tried the HO100 being fed by either, I can't remember now, whether it was the Chord TT2 or the Chord Dave that I've got in for review. What that showed me was that the HO100 has a slightly punchy, warm sound, but it's not thick or lacking in dynamics, it's actually just got a really nice good sense of body to it. The DO100 on the other hand is a fairly neutral and dry sounding DAC. It's perhaps got the tiniest sense of graininess to its sound, and that's kind of what I mean when I say it's dry. It hasn't got anything that I'd call liquid or rich about the sound. It's very, very neutral and a little bit dry. That said, it's not at all bad, and it seems to be a wonderful pairing when you put these two together. So you've got that little bit of warmth and punch from the HO100, and it's very, very subtle. And you're pairing that up with the very, very subtle dryness and graininess from the DO100, and the end result you get is a wonderful sounding system. At least in isolation, that's what I thought. And so I started hunting around for some comparisons to really find out. And as I mentioned before, one of the first things I wanted to do was to put the DO100 up against the Topping E50. These are somewhat similarly priced, and whilst I much prefer having XLR outputs as the DO100 does, I can't help but really, really love the sound of the Topping E50. For those not familiar with the E50, it uses TRS outputs on the back, so they're like a 6.3mm connection instead of an XLR connection, and there are less devices around that take that type of input. So you're going to have to find adapters or adapter cables, sometimes custom made. There's a bit of fiddling involved if you want to use the E50 in balanced mode. But if we put that aside and just look at the sound, one of the tracks I used for this test was Just For Today by George Harrison. And listening to both DACs on this track, flipping back and forth, what I heard was that the Topping E50 has that sense of liquid sound. It's got that articulation and that smoothness that I really, really enjoy. It actually beats the DO100 for me in terms of the sense of airiness and separations of the sound. And it does so without ever getting rich or thick or anything like that. It's just a little bit less dry and a little bit more articulate. And that's why I like the E50 so much. In contrast to that airiness from the E50, I find the DO100 has just a slightly thicker sound in comparison. It's not a thick sounding DAC by any stretch, but the airiness of the E50 just takes it to another level for me. At the end of this listening test, I definitely felt like I preferred the sound of the E50, but ergonomically it is a hard DAC for me to go for. Both the lack of the XLR outputs on the back of the E50 is an issue, but also the fact that with the DO100, you do get those physical controls, and that's something that I definitely value as a desktop headphone listener. Some people are going to be happy sitting back with a remote control, and so that argument's irrelevant for you, but if you're like me and sitting at a desk, you may prefer the control wheel on the DO100. I should also make it really clear that the DO100 doesn't sound bad in comparison to the E50, but the E50 is just a little bit better and kind of cements itself for me as one of the best sounding DACs at its price. So if you're happy to mix and match your devices, maybe you're only looking for a DAC and you're not put off by the use of the TRS outputs, then I do think the E50 is still the slightly better choice. But if the ergonomics and the control are important to you, the DO100 is sitting right there behind it. And so I came back after doing that first comparison with the E50 to thinking about this again in its stack format. And one of the most obvious comparisons that I had here on hand was the baby brother to these in the SMSL SU-6 and SH-6 stack, coming from the exact same brand and just being a $100 cheaper device with a few less features. I was really interested to see how the 6 stack compared to the 100 stack. I fired up Other Side of the World by Katie Tunstall, and in listening to that across both different stacks, I found that the 6 stack really pushes everything much more left-right compared to the 100 stack. The 6 stack also produces a sound which is a bit drier overall, so I mentioned before that the DAC in the DO100 is a little bit dry. The whole stack in the 6 stack is a little bit dry, whereas I think the DO100 HO100 combo balances the overall presentation a little bit better between that dryness and neutrality and accuracy, whilst also having a little bit of that articulation and smoothness that I think makes for a more musical listen. Coming back around to that soundstage presentation I mentioned at the beginning, where the 6 stack does separate everything very left-right, so it puts Katie Tunstall dead centre, the guitar to the hard right, the keyboard to the hard left, and then some of the other sounds kind of scattered in the middle. Whilst the 6 stack did give me that sort of left-right split, I felt like there was just a bit more nuance from the DO HO100 stack. It just gave me a slightly greater sense of depth, and rather than it being all these individual pockets of sound, I felt like everything married together more, while still being very, very clearly separated. And so for me, if you've got the extra budget to spend, and you're happy with a slightly larger set of devices on your desk, I do think that the 100 stack is the better choice. It offers a little bit more power, should that be relevant, and realistically it shouldn't really matter because the 6 stack already has 1.3 watts at 32 ohms, making it plenty powerful for anything you're likely to be driving. But if you do want that little bit more, the 100 stack does have that, and I think because it uses 2 DAC chips in the DAC, the DO100 that is, compared to 1 chip in the SU-6, I think that's helping just to separate the channels a bit better and produce an overall better end result. They're not miles and miles apart, but at the same time I do think there's a definite benefit in buying the 100 stack. My final comparison then was based on the idea that if you're going to spend as much as you're going to spend on the 100 stack, i.e. that $100 more than the 6 stack, then what if you looked at something like the Topping DX5? I was very impressed with the Topping DX5 when I recently reviewed it. It's an all-in-one device, but it offers very similar functionality to what you get here, only in a single box and therefore only requiring a power cable and an input cable. So I plugged in both setups and I tried both, listening to Wacken by Glamour. The most obvious thing that struck me as I went back and forth between these two was just how similar they actually sound. I felt like once again the 100 stack had a bit of an edge in the separation of sounds and definitely in a tiny sense of depth that it provides that the DX5 really doesn't. And I also once again noticed that the DX5 has this slight sense of enhancement or crispness in the top end. Now that could be good or bad depending on your taste and your headphones, but to me the DO100 HO100 stack was delivering the slightly more natural and therefore slightly more enjoyable overall presentation. Having said that, the 100 stack does come across slightly smoother, and so on a track like Wacken where you've got the guitar strums, some people are going to prefer the extra energy and sense of clarity and attack, I guess you could call it, that the DX5 brings. To me, I find the DO100 HO100 combo to be a bit more natural sounding, but that's going to be entirely preferential. And so really for me, after going back and forth between the two, I'd say both are kind of equally as good. If you don't want the separate boxes and you don't want to have to worry about interconnects connecting your DAC and your amp and therefore go for an all-in-one, the DX5 is really hard to go past. But if you want a slight increase in that naturality of the sound and you're happy to have a stack, then I think the DO100 HO100 is as good as you're going to get around that price point. If it's relevant, it might be worth mentioning that the DX5 has MQA capabilities and it's also again got a bit more power. You've got 1.8 watts from the Topping versus 1.5 watts, this is into 32 ohms, from the HO100. So take that into account if you're deciding between the two, but it's going to be very hard to go wrong. And so after playing with the HO100 DO100 combo for a while, I'm really, really impressed. I think they're both great devices in isolation. If you ask me to choose which of the two devices I think is better, I think the headphone amp probably has the slight edge here because there's something like the E50 in the world. But if you're looking at it as an all-in-one stack type setup, I think it's very, very hard to beat for the same amount of money. And unless you particularly need a more compact device like the Topping DX5, or you don't want separates that require interconnects and cables, then I think the DO100 HO100 is a pretty easy recommendation. And so if that's of interest to you, check out the link below through to Aoshida. There's no affiliates or kickbacks or sponsorship. It's just a way of saying thank you to them for sending these units out for review. If you found this review useful and has helped you to make up your mind, or maybe you just found it entertaining and enjoyable, I'd also love it if you consider subscribing if you haven't already, and hit the like button and maybe leave me a comment. Any and all interaction with the channel helps to build the channel and grow the channel and help me to bring in more products like these to share with you. So thank you to all of you for watching and supporting Passion for Sound. But for now, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.